You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl with a special show on Myanmar's elections. It's been a long, hard road to reform, but it looks like Myanmar might be on the right track. The Nobel Peace Prize laureate Aung San Suu Kyi won a by-election at the weekend and will enter the country's parliament. In some ways, she personifies national suffering under a cruel military junta, which has only recently embraced reforms. The United States says it will relax sanctions. The European Union may follow suit. China today said all sanctions should be lifted against the country formerly known as Burma. So is it time to welcome Myanmar back into the family of nations? Or should the West press for bolder reforms and justice for the junta's many victims? And can the democratic transition in Myanmar be mirrored in other countries, perhaps even North Korea? To probe these questions, we're hosting a debate in our London studio. I'm joined by Zoya Pan from the rights group Burma Campaign UK, Justin Wintle, author of Perfect Hostage, Aung San Suu Kyi, Jonas Parello-Plesner from the think tank the European Council on Foreign Relations, and Jim Della-Giacoma, an analyst for the International Crisis Group. Okay, to get the ball rolling, I want to get a single sentence answer from each of you to the following question. Is it time for the West to drop all sanctions against Myanmar? Justin, maybe to you first.
Absolutely, and I've been saying that for several years, except for the arms embargo should be kept.
Okay, and Zoya?
No, it's not the right time that the West should release all sanctions against the government in Burma because not all the benchmarks has been met yet.
Okay, and maybe Jonas?
No, I would also say it should be gradual lifting that fits with the reform steps taken in Burma.
And Jim?
The reform has been quite dramatic, so all the sanctions, with the exception of the arms embargo, should go as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I'll turn back to you, Zoya. You said not yet. You were calling for a slightly more gradual reducing of sanctions because not all the benchmarks have been met yet. What do you want to see the junta do before there should be a loosening of these curbs?
The first is free and fair by-elections, which wasn't really free and fair on the 1st of April. And second, the release of all political prisoners, which we still have hundreds of political prisoners. And third, ending of the conflict in ethnic area. And we still have Burmese army attacking ethnic minorities in different parts of Burma. And the repressive laws that put these political activists remain in place. So as long as the government is continuing with their repressive law, we can't see real progress in Burma and genuine peace in the country.
Jonas, that seems to be something similar to what you were saying. Are those basically the same kind of benchmarks that you were talking about?
Yes, that's roughly so. I mean, I recently published a paper on how the EU could sort of help reform in Burma. But I think we could also, in the next phase, set some new benchmarks because some of it, there will be reforms, but then it's about how is it actually carried out. If you look at the political prisoners, some have been released, but their sentences have not been revoked, but it's just been suspended, which means they could go back. And so, I mean, it's also a lot of it was going to lie in the detail of how Burma reforms and where the West can still use as much having these remaining sanctions to sort of notch it in the right direction. It's also a sign to the reformers inside Burma that there is still a road to be traveled to completely rejoin the international community.
Jim, you were saying that the reforms that have been carried out by the former junta leaders has been dramatic, and you think they need some bigger rewards now. Is that right?
I would say that by removing the sanctions, there's a possibility to add momentum and to show that the bold moves that the president has taken in allowing them to be, routed by the NLD. I think there are concerns about whether they were always free or fair, but I think the results speak for themselves, and there has to be some sort of dramatic response. The sanctions as a political tool are blunt and don't work, and particularly the financial sanctions have hurt poor people in Burma for many years, and it's time that they were stopped being punished when the country's heading in the direction that we all want.
Just to clarify, when you said NLD, that's the National League for Democracy. That's the party of Aung San Suu Kyi, right?
Correct, yes.
And putting that one to you, Justin, because you take a similar position on sanctions. You don't think they're ever a good thing?
Well, I wouldn't say that. I think they have to be used very, very carefully. I thought sanctions were worth trying back in the 1990s just to see if they would budge the regime then, and they didn't. Then the problem is if you impose sanctions, which quite honestly I find a rather neo-imperialist instrument of foreign policy, applied inconsistently, by the way. There was never any talk of applying sanctions to China after Tiananmen Square. But the trouble is, once you apply sanctions, then you paint yourself into a corner. Now, there clearly are, as Zoya has said, ongoing difficulties and human rights abuses in Burma. What has happened is quite remarkable. My gut feeling is that the more we can do to help with the all-important economic reform there, and I was there last month, and it's still a dirt poor country. The infrastructure is hopeless, blah, blah, blah. And the more we can do to build up that economy within its local context of ASEAN, the Southeast Asian nations, that is the best guarantee of ongoing political reform and a healthier society in the future.
Okay, I think at this moment I'd like to play you an audio clip. This is Prime Minister Lee from Singapore.
I think we took the right approach in keeping Myanmar in the family and working with Myanmar rather than trying to ostracize it. I hope that this will help them to considerably improve their links with the world, particularly the developed world. And I hope certainly that the sanctions will be lifted, because really the sanctions are not helpful.
Maybe Zoya, I'll turn to you first and see if I can get some response on that. That's Singapore's leader, Lee, calling for an end to sanctions, saying that the course that has been chosen by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations to not be too critical of Myanmar is yielding fruit. Don't you think that the recent events have proven them correct?
First, it's very disappointing to hear a leader from Southeast Asian nations talking about the lifting of sanctions without concrete evidence of changing taking place in Burma. Because what the results that we've seen on the 1st of April by elections, of course it is welcome to see the victory of NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi herself, and that is what people want, and they had courage to vote for her and her party. However, the result of these by-elections alone cannot be translated as Burma is free or even closer to be free, because we still have many other problems. And again, international communities has played very important role in making these kind of small positive steps happen in Burma. For example, Sanctions has played very significant role. Without sanctions and without international pressure, I don't believe that this government in Burma would just wake up one morning and change their mind and think that, oh, it is time to introduce democracy in Burma. Of course, they know very well what they are doing, and they want international sanctions lifted. That's why they are opening up some small political spaces. So far, it is welcome, but we still have a long way to go. And if the West is lifting all sanctions at the moment, I'm afraid it will undermine the current positive changes that taking place in Burma.
Jim, maybe I'll ask you to come back on that, because it seems to be that you're at odds with Zoya.
Well, I think, living out here in Southeast Asia, I would observe that Myanmar now has, or Burma now has more opposition parties in parliament than Singapore. The press law might give the country a freer press than Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. It has elections which don't happen in Brunei, or it has a multi-party system that Vietnam would never tolerate. So I think it's very rapidly, compared to its neighbors, moving into a position which is more democratic in all different kinds of ways than other members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And so I think, we've got to recognize that, put it in perspective, and removing the sanctions can encourage it to move forward and keep moving forward. The changes have been coming from within the country. The leaders have recognized that they've been left behind compared to their neighbors, and they want to catch up. To change the economy, they've got to change the political system, and that's what we're seeing here. It's top-down, it's a little unusual, it's not coming up from a people's movement, but these changes are still real, and political space and democracy is growing in the country.
And Jonas, maybe I'll let you come back on that one, because you think there need to be more signs from the junta that used to rule Burma.
It's basically a slight different interpretation. I mean, I'm more saying that we need just to be gradual, because there is inside also the military, probably reformers like the president himself, like the industry minister, railway minister. So there's some that sort of push the agenda and want to move Burma forward, and there are probably others that have the vested privileges and would like at some point to see this stop and not go much further. So if all of the West just lifted sanctions right away, I mean, part of the incentive of actually continuing on that track would be lost, which is why I think gradual would be the right way. That would also make it possible for us to sort of start with now lifting sanctions on development assistance, so that further capacity building, so in all the areas where Burma is actually undertaking reform, the West could come in and help and assist Burma in that undertaking. It would also make us possible, if we did it a bit gradually, to sort of prepare our own businesses, to say what we need is also to show the right phase when they re-enter Burma massively and invest in Burma, which would be a good thing. And then, but have a sort of a strategy on corporate social responsibility, so that our companies actually show that with that approach that they enter Burma. At the beginning of the reform period, there was actually popular protest inside Burma against the Chinese-led dam projects. So, I mean, if the West could come in with projects that would show that they really benefit the people, that I think would be a big improvement as well. And we might need some time to sort of prepare our companies for such a framework.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're discussing Myanmar reform and its recent elections. I'm joined by Zoa Pan from the rights group Burma Campaign UK, Justin Wintle, author of Perfect Hostage, Aung San Suu Kyi, Jonas Parello-Plesner from the think tank the European Council on Foreign Relations, and Jim Della-Giacoma, Southeast Asia Project Director for the International Crisis Group. Okay, I'd like to take this opportunity to play you a second clip. This is a moment just after the results of the elections came out, and the speaker is Aung San Suu Kyi herself.
It is not so much our triumph as a triumph of the people who had decided that they must be involved in the political process of this country. So what is important is not how many seats we have won, although of course we are extremely gratified that we have won so many, but the fact that the people are so enthusiastic about participating in the democratic process. We hope that this will be the beginning of a new era where there will be more emphasis on the role of the people in the everyday politics of our country. We also hope that we will be able to go further along the road towards national reconciliation. We would welcome all parties who would wish to join us in the process of bringing peace and prosperity to our country.
Okay, maybe I'll turn to you on that one, Justin, because you're obviously such an expert on the character herself. She's just won a seat in Parliament at that point, and she talks of hope for a new era and talks of national reconciliation. What do you make of her comments?
Well, in the context of the past 20 years, 15 of which she spent under house arrest, although it is only a by-election, the NLD gets 40 seats, but that doesn't give it any real power inside the National Assembly. It is nonetheless a momentous event, because it means that she's been brought back into the fold. U Thein Sein, the president of Myanmar, has been very clever in the way that he's co-opted her into the reform program. They met last August in the new capital, Naypyidaw. Up until that time, Aung San Suu Kyi said that she would have nothing to do with what she thought was a bogus constitution, but he persuaded her that the way forward was cooperation. And I think that is the way forward. What is important is how the political landscape of Burma, Myanmar, has been reconfigured ahead of the 2015 election. Now, I'm going to say something a little controversial, which is, if in 2015, provided there's no major derailment of the political reform movement between now and then, if the NLD were to get 80% of the vote in 2015, as they did in 1990, that would actually not be very good for democracy. What I would hope between now and then is that there is the emergence of a second organised party, so it's a genuine contest, so that parties in the 2015 election can campaign on issues. The state party does absolutely not campaign on issues. the USDP, the Union Solidarity and Development Party, it is usually campaigned by bullying people, cajoling people into vote. For the sake of democracy, pluralism, political pluralism, is the next big step.
Maybe I'll turn to you, Zoya, at that stage. Justin was describing a momentous change in the political landscape of the country, but do we have reason to be suspicious? Because even within the current political framework, even though Aung San Suu Kyi now has a parliamentary seat, that doesn't mean that the system isn't still stitched up in the favour of the generals, does it?
Well, so far, the changes that we have seen so far in Burma are just are not fundamental or deep reform that people in Burma want to have a long-lasting peace. There is no political progress. There is no national reconciliations. Some of those political prisoners who were released, they were released with the Code 401, which is they could be rearrested any time if they are charged with any criminal act or basically their political activities. And again, many organizations are still considered as banned organizations or unlawful associations because the dictatorship in Burma still use the term the repressive law. And again, the attack against ethnic minorities in different parts of Burma actually still going on, and human rights violations has increased in the past year. We are talking about 70,000 people in Kachin state, in northern part of Burma alone, who have been forced to flee from their homeland and become internally displaced people because Thein Sein's troops has broken 3 ceasefire agreements with ethnic armed political parties in the past years. And there is no political dialogue between Thein Sein government and ethnic armed groups. And I know from first-hand experience, I am from Burma. When I was 14, I was forced to flee from my homeland because of the attack by the Burmese army. And we were forced in the jungle, and then I ended up in refugee camp in Thailand. And we were attacked with air bombs and air strikes. And each time the bombs dropped on the ground would shake. And unfortunately, this kind of attack is still going on in Burma. For me, it was 15 years ago. That's why the situation in Burma, it is still very, very important, and we want international community to stay with us, to support us by maintaining most and key economic sanctions to pressure the government in Burma into a deep and fundamental reform. And we need to see the release of all political prisoners. We need to see a nationwide ceasefire where the government stop attacking ethnic minorities. And so far, although we are talking about this small parliament, this parliament is basically powerless because most of the members are from pro-military parties, and above the parliament there is the president, and the president is not accountable to the people or the parliament. And above the president there is National Defense and Security Council, and above the council there is the military, which has absolute power, and that is based on the current constitution.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're debating Myanmar, the elections and human rights violations. I'm joined by Zoa Pan from the rights group Burma Campaign UK, Justin Wintle, author of Perfect Hostage, Aung San Suu Kyi, Jonas Parello-Plesner from the think tank the European Council on Foreign Relations, and Jim Della-Giacoma, Southeast Asia Project Director for the International Crisis Group. Jim, it's you that I want to turn to now, because we've just heard quite a long series of allegations from Zoya, political prisoners, forced labour, other human rights violations, 70,000 people in one particular state forced to flee from their homes. Isn't the problem with the route that you advocate, lifting of sanctions, welcoming Myanmar back into the fold, doesn't that mean that there's a danger of there not being justice for the victims of the junta?
Well, I think justice is something that will take many years to achieve, and that's actually something for the citizens of Myanmar to work out over time. If you look at the region, there are people still waiting for justice from the 1960s here in Indonesia. But I think, we need to sort of recognize that consolidating peace in the ethnic areas is a major challenge, but sanctions is not the tool that will bring about that change. It will take negotiations, it will take a real rethinking to imagine itself as a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country, and this is a long road to walk. And to sort of the sense that placing bans on aid, for example, that can be given for HIV/AIDS is going to somehow translate into peace in the Kachin state is misplaced. In the meantime, there are people not getting antiretroviral drugs because of these sanctions. There are farmers not getting agricultural assistance that their neighbors in Cambodia or Laos or Thailand or all over Southeast Asia get from the international community. These sanctions are a very blunt instrument that will not have the desired effects. But I think in particularly, the government has signed a number of peace agreements. Now the challenge is to make them sustainable, is to bring a peace dividend, and that's where the international community can come in if they're not restricted by these sanctions. I think having an economic dividend will add momentum to the change and keep the country on the track of being engaged with the rest of the world. I think we have to sort of recognize that there are these human rights violations are real. The violations of international humanitarian law or the wars of law are real. But the sanctions is not going to bring justice. Having at some point there will need to be a sort of transitional justice process that will come from within the country. But issues, for example, forced labour, there's been significant progress on that through engagement, not by wielding a big against the government.
I want to follow up on that with an open question to everyone. I mean, if you look around the world, there aren't many dictatorial regimes which give up power willingly. I mean, we can look at what happened to Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein or, even what's been happening in Syria with President Bashar al-Assad. Nobody ever really wants to give up the power that they hold. So what has happened in Myanmar? Why has a state willingly accepted reforms if it had nothing to do with international sanctions and pressure?
Well, if I can come in here, I sometimes compare what's happening in Myanmar at the moment with what happened in Spain after Franco died, and you've got a kind of similar situation now that the fascist dictator Than Shwe, after he stood down. I think it is genuinely complex why this reform movement has really happened. I think that the chief condition was economic. The Burmese economy was really on the floor when Thein Sein took over. The only major line of credit was China, and the Burmese, I think, don't want to be beholden to anybody at all. It is extraordinary when Thein Sein gave a presidential address in the lower house to mark the first year, and it was a kind of State of the Union address. That speech really bent over backwards to answer questions which had been raised by the West, and it's quite extraordinary that a former general Burmese leader should have done that. I think there's been a lot of pressure from ASEAN, from the countries in ASEAN. Remember, Myanmar's going to take the chair of ASEAN in 2014. As importantly, I think they are staging the Asian Games in Naypyidaw in 2013. There is a feeling that there was a set of cool-headed army commanders who realized they couldn't go for any kind of reform for as long as Than Shwe was in power. But once he stepped down, then all sorts of things became possible. It's all ad hoc. Everything's up in the air. It's fragile. There could be a backlash. But I think that the way forward is to encourage what's happening now.
Okay, and we're running out of time now, so maybe I'll let everybody else have one more go, and we'll turn to you first, Jonas. What do you see on the horizon for Myanmar? Do you see more reforms, or do you see a danger of a backlash? And is there anything we've learned from Myanmar that could be replicated with other countries? Can reforms be encouraged in places like North Korea and elsewhere?
I think, we need both tools. So we need engagement, and I would hope that the first sanction to go would be the one on development assistance, so that we can actually come in and try to help some of these reforms along and these go on. But again, that is sort of part of the gradual approach that I advocate for, then not lifting the rest of them and then sort of have something else ready for later, and thereby hope that the Burmese themselves and the regime sort of keep on pushing on reform. At the moment, we haven't sort of gone beyond the comfort zone, you could say, of the regime. This is all really part of the roadmap with the constitution and of bringing about these changes. I mean, it's really when we see the vested privileges, particularly in the economy, which we didn't get to discuss that much, where the army has a large stakes in state-owned companies. If they're willing to sort of open up and have a much freer market economy, this will also be a sign that the army is really prepared for another type of society.
And Zoya, maybe I'll let you get in there. Do you feel there's been enough progress now? Are you feeling positive about the future?
Well, I'm hopeful about the situation in Burma, but at the same time, I'm still skeptical and I'm cautious because of the reasons that I gave earlier. We still have a long way to go. And when Aung San Suu Kyi was asked to see where Burma is at the moment on the scale of 1 to 10, and she said we are on our way to 1. Doesn't mean we still have a long way to go. And one thing that I would like to point out to James is that the sanctions that we've been asking and the sanctions that the EU is having so far are just targeted sanctions that target the generals in Burma and their business cronies. It's not sanctions that target the people in Burma. It's not blanket sanctions like in other countries. And actually, it is bullets that kill people in Burma. It's not sanctions that hurt the people, because those farmers who James described earlier, they suffered and they are in difficult situation because of the economic policy by the government in Burma. Their land have been confiscated and they had to pay high tax to the government, and they are also used as forced labor by the government. They don't have time to work for their own farm, and add up with many other human rights violations in Burma. That's why they suffer. And as long as this kind of repressive laws remain in place, people in Burma won't be able to enjoy their rights. And to judge the president or the government in Burma by his words and his promise, it would be a mistake to make the policy on Burma, because we have to see more actions. We have to see more deeper reforms in Burma before we have key sanctions lifted. So far, I agree with Jonas that we should only see gradual lifting of sanctions until there is genuine democratic reform in Burma.
Okay, that was Zoya Pan from the rights group Burma Campaign UK, warning that the military generals of Myanmar should take stronger steps towards reform before they get encouraged by lifting of sanctions. I was also joined by Justin Wintle, author of Perfect Hostage, Aung San Suu Kyi, Jonas Parello-Plesner from the think tank the European Council on Foreign Relations, and over the phone from Jakarta by Jim Della-Giacoma, an analyst for the International Crisis Group. You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. Stay tuned. The headlines are going to be coming up next. We're always interested in finding out what our listeners think about the show. If you'd like to suggest a subject for discussion, you can contact us with comments, suggestions and ideas via email. The address is uk@ruvr.ru.